Immortals Fenyx Rising. When I first talked about this game after the preview session that Ubisoft hosted, you may recall I came away with very positive impressions, and I'm now happy to say that I came away with equally positive impressions for the final game, which I played on the Xbox Series X. It is, I would say, the most fun I've had with a Ubisoft game in quite some time. Now, it is undeniably Ubisoft's Breath of the Wild. The inspirations are obvious. I mean, you can climb any surface, you're encouraged to glide around the world for the fastest form of traversal. There are shrine equivalents called Vaults of Tartarus, physics puzzle focused mini dungeons. There are even some larger sized dungeons in the main quest that are maybe closer to the Zelda traditional big dungeons, though more Breath of the Wild-esque because the puzzles are more physics-based. Puzzles are also scattered around the open world in the open field, and there's a stamina meter that rules over many aspects of navigation and combat, and elements like art style are very much Breath of the Wild-esque as well. There are things like taming wild mounts, for example, that are also pretty much taken directly from Breath of the Wild. But I don't want to say that this is a full-on copy and paste job, because this game actually does feel distinct enough where I would say it is its own unique game. The open world is the star of the show, as it has to be with a game like this. It's expansive, it is often gorgeous to look at thanks to its art style, which has Breath of the Wild looking environments, but character models are kind of like a cross between what you might see in Fortnite and the Civ 6 leaders character models, and the open world is mostly completely open. After a tutorial portion, you can pretty much go wherever you want, and there is a lot to do. So as Fenyx in this open world, your goal is to go around and return these 4 Greek gods to their original state after the main villain, Typhon, sealed them away in a weakened state. And each region in this game world is representative of one of these gods, so each region has a distinct visual, has distinct music, has some variations in enemy types, and even distinct sort of major dungeons, if you will. Most of the game will be spent tackling the Vaults of Tartarus and open world puzzles. That's where the chunk of the core experience lies. The vaults themselves are generally pretty fun to figure out. Puzzles did start out kind of simple, but as I kept doing more of these vaults, there were moments where I did see the puzzles get more complex, intricate, and mechanically interesting. And some of the bigger Zelda dungeon-esque vaults are especially interesting in some of the puzzle implementations. There's some cool stuff there that I thought was really unique and that genuinely impressed me. There are some vaults that I didn't like, particularly those that focused heavily on platforming. The game's just not a good platformer, so I don't know why they would make entire vaults dedicated to platforming. And it doesn't help that every time you fall, it takes a bit too long for that to load and respawn, and so it just feels really tedious to go through those. And much like with Breath of the Wild, some of these shrines or vaults are just combat challenges, and I do wish they would have had different arenas for each combat challenge and made things more interesting that way, but they all take place in the same arena and vary up the enemies here and there. But overall, I found that the combat challenge vaults were serviceable, but they could have done more with it. All in all, though, I am really pleased with most of the vaults that I stumbled upon, and because puzzles are physics-based, there are creative alternative solutions that you can undertake from time to time when it is allowed, using some of your abilities, or just kind of figuring out clever ways to take advantage of the game's physics elements. And then there are the open world outdoors puzzles, which tend to be simpler and less grand than the vaults, but still are a good distraction, can still offer some pretty neat puzzles here and there, or some pretty neat challenges. So you've got navigation challenges, basically reach a destination before time runs out. Constellation challenges, which involves finding these blue orbs and slotting them in the right place. There are what are called myth challenges, which involve Things like having to shoot an arrow and control it through an obstacle course. There are what are called fresco challenges, which involves you having to take square tiles and move them a certain way so they form the appropriate image. There are the lyre challenges, which is basically music memorization, memorizing notes and patterns. Legendary creatures, which are open world bosses, also dot the land. And then there are also a few hidden quests here and there that you may stumble upon. All of this stuff is outside the main quest. And much like with the vaults, most of them are, at worst, serviceable, and at best, pretty interesting and quite fun. Though, much like with the vaults, there are a few types that I didn't like. So there are a number of these open-world puzzles, which don't really feel like puzzles because the puzzles themselves are really simple. It might be, you have to press these 2 buttons, but the main component of that puzzle is basically find the objects that you have to place on the buttons to push them down. Basically involves having to look for something rather than solve something. And then beyond the puzzles, there are things like treasure chests out in the world that grant gear and crafting materials and cosmetics. Some are out in the open and you can just open them. Others require you to solve a puzzle before you can open a chest. Others might require you to kill all enemies in an area before the chest is unlocked. Now, as cool as it is that the world is so dense with activities, I feel like one area where Immortals falters is the sense of discovery. So in Breath of the Wild, for example, the way you would discover is that your eye would catch something in the distance and you would kind of go, what is that? Your curiosity would be piqued. You'd go there and then there'd be a sense of wonder from discovering something that your senses picked up on. In Immortals, though, the way you discover really is by using a mechanic called Farsight. So you hold down the R3 button, the right analog stick, and you go in first-person mode, at which point you can look around, and basically if you're looking directly at a point of interest, you can push the trigger button to reveal the icon and reveal it on the map. So it could be, puzzles, chests, activities, you name it. And it feels really cheap and exploitable. I found that all I had to do was go to some high place, pan the camera around kind of willy-nilly, and then spam the trigger button. I would kind of go in lines or circles and try to cover as much surface area as possible while spamming the trigger button, and just like that, I would basically reveal a region's icons, an entire region's icons this way. And so I was no longer discovering, I was just kind of following the icons that I had revealed. And to reveal a point of interest, they don't even have to be within your line of sight. Even if there's an object obstructing it, you can still mark it. I feel like the game might have just been better off revealing all of a region's icons once you scout a region through a UB tower, essentially. It's just, it just feels like a waste of time that isn't a fulfilling sense of discovery. But the good news is that because the world is so dense and the activities tend to be varied and for the most part pretty fun, as you're going to a main quest, there's always something distracting you. There's always somewhere you can go to tackle a puzzle, an activity. There's always some side thing to do. And you can really pace yourself because it is up to you whether you want to tackle these puzzles and earn the rewards, or if you just want to beeline through the main quest, or if you want to mix and match. It's really up to you, the pacing of the game's progression, which I found to be a positive point. Now, beyond puzzle solving, there's of course combat. That's a big part of this game, and I must say I really, really enjoy Immortals combat. I did during the preview, and I still enjoyed it now. They basically took the modern Assassin's Creed's combat as a foundation and stylized it significantly, so it kind of looks a bit like Devil May Cry or Bayonetta once you unlock a decent amount of skills and abilities, godly powers as they're known in this game. It's not quite as in-depth as Devil May Cry or Bayonetta, but you can juggle enemies, you can unleash powerful attacks, and it just feels good. And the way combat mainly works is there are light attacks with your swords, which restore stamina and deal damage. Heavy attacks with axes deal damage, but mainly deal stun damage, and if you chip away at an enemy's stun meter, they will be stunned for a period of time, which you can use to unleash whatever attacks you want. And then for defensive capabilities, there's dodge and parrying, and then alongside all of that, the 6 godly powers that use your stamina, so you want to use your light attacks to build up the stamina that will allow you to use godly powers when appropriate. And when you combine all of these elements, again, you're launching enemies in the air, juggling them here and there, unleashing AoE attacks, and really just taking out entire mobs, and it looks and feels great. And once you get the flow of combat, and once you get to a point where you're able to dodge and parry and attack enemies adequately to the point where you take no damage during an encounter, it's never not satisfying, and it always has a sense of impact. Now, I do have three main issues with the game's combat. One, the lock-on system is really bad when there are lots of enemies. The lock-on symbol is this really small, thin yellow icon. It's often hard to see with everything going on screen, and as a result, when you're locked on, it's often hard to tell which specific enemy you're locked on to when you're fighting like a horde of enemies, especially when they're all bunched up together. And the camera also doesn't snap to a locked on target, and when you switch targets, it doesn't immediately snap to that target. It kind of floats around, so when you switch targets, it's hard to actually tell that you switch targets or which target you've now locked on to. A second issue I have is that enemy wind-up animations before they attack, a lot of them can be hard to see, especially when there's a lot going on screen. Some of the attack animations just aren't obvious, the wind-up at least, and the indicators for incoming attacks aren't implemented the best, so sometimes when fighting lots of enemies at once, it's hard to keep track of everything because everything just kind of blends, and like wind-up animations kind of look like idle animations, and so you cannot react appropriately as a result. I got kind of used to it eventually once I really learned enemies, but I feel like they could have done a better job choreographing attacks better so players have a better chance of reacting. And then the third issue that I encountered is that the game doesn't seem to register attack inputs mid-animation. So one of the things that I like to do is use a power that allows me to pull myself up to enemies and then do a downward thrust with the axe, and that requires me to hold down the right trigger button, which is the heavy attack button. But if I hold that button down too early as I'm zooming into an enemy mid-animation, the input won't trigger, so I'll kind of pull myself up to an enemy and then my character won't do the downward thrust despite me holding that button down all the way through. But because I press the button too early, it may not register. And that also sometimes happens on the ground when I want to do an axe smash and I hold down the right trigger button. If I do that while like the character is maybe swinging and I do it too early, it's sometimes just not responsive, which is unfortunate. Now, I didn't mind this, but some people might. There aren't a huge variety of weapons that you can swap in and out. Your light attacks will always use a sword. Your heavy attacks will always use axes. And so those are your two main weapons. You don't get to wield spears and other weapons like you can in Assassin's Creed, for example. I don't mind it too much. I like that combat had you focus on very few specific things that you upgrade and master. But I know some people do like the customizability of what weapon you wield. You don't get that in this game. I didn't mind it all that much, but, you know, you should know just in case that's a big deal for you. And then beyond mechanics, the game could have benefited from a bit more enemy variety. The variety isn't too bad, but I think it could have been a bit better. But the game does make up for that with some really cool boss battles here and there, which do have unique movesets. All these issues aside, though, I didn't feel like any of them ultimately made combat unbearable or anything. Combat, actually, I felt was generally really flashy. It felt really impactful, especially when time slows down for a second as you dish out an impactful attack. Godly powers especially feel really awesome to use, and fighting the game's myriad creatures and monsters and a mix of these different enemy types is just an entertaining experience. And combat is also engaging, meaning that you cannot get away with button mashing. There are certain enemy types that are affected by certain abilities more. You have to learn enemy patterns to attack and parry and dodge appropriately. So you do have to pay attention. It's not some mind-numbing experience where you're just mindlessly pressing buttons. All of these different activities, puzzles, chess, combat, you name it, all contribute to the game's really well-paced progression. So there are different currencies essentially in this game for different types of upgrades. Outdoor puzzles yield what are called coins of Charon or Karen that can be spent on upgrading skills and godly powers. There are Vaults of Tartarus, which will yield Zeus's lightning, which can be used to upgrade your stamina, which is pivotal in a game where the stamina bar is such a key element to navigation and combat. You'll stumble upon what are called ambrosia in the open world out and about or in chests that can be spent to upgrade your health. Defeating legendary creatures will yield crafting materials as well as new cosmetic rewards. And speaking of crafting materials, there are plenty of those throughout the open world in chests, and they're used to craft or upgrade weapons, armor, and the capacity of arrows and potions. And I especially like how upgrading weapons and armor works in this game. Instead of upgrading individual weapons and armor, you're upgrading an entire class or category of gear. So if you upgrade your sword, for example, all your swords will benefit from that upgrade, and same thing goes with axes, bows, helmets, and armors. And at a certain point, when you have upgraded a certain gear type enough, you will unlock new perks associated with specific weapons and armor. And these perks are the selling point for creating different builds. So I focus my build on stunning enemies, so anything that would up my stun damage I would equip. But you can make other builds that focus on, say, healing yourself or maintaining your stamina. There are certain gear that will reward the use of light attacks or heavy attacks. You can mix and match these different elements. And a neat feature is that if you like the perks and upgrades of one gear but prefer the look of another, you can just swap out the look of a gear to anything you already own at any time. And this isn't anything new. Ubisoft has done this before, but it's still a nice, really neat feature worth highlighting. And beyond all of those currencies, you'll also find chests that yield new swords, axes, helmets, or armor, as well as new cosmetic visuals for various components of the game. And not just your gear, but also your wings or the Fenyx that accompanies you. And then one more extra layer to progression is what are called blessings that you get from the 4 gods that you have to restore. As you keep doing quests for them, they'll keep granting you blessings, 3 per god, which are powerful passive boosts and abilities. So as I kept playing through the game, it always felt like I was being rewarded. My character always felt like they were getting better and more powerful, and every upgrade feels substantial. And there are also tasks that you can accomplish for Hermes, challenges essentially, that you kind of fulfill as you play through the game normally, kill a certain number of enemies, do this maneuver a certain amount of times, whatever it is, and those will also yield all of those different currencies and rewards if you do them and complete them. And that's on top of dailies and weeklies that you can choose to tackle to earn a unique currency called Electrum that are used to purchase cosmetics and various items from Hermes himself. Now, Electrum isn't directly tied to microtransactions, but the items featured in this in-game store, there are cosmetics that are sold in the actual store where you spend real dollars, and this is sort of a less convenient way with items kind of rotating and with options being reduced, whereas if you go to the actual microtransaction store, you can kind of buy these items in bulk. I didn't see anything in the way of gameplay affecting items like Zeus's lightning or coins of Charon, though it is unfortunate that some of the cosmetics in the store do look really cool, and I wish those could be implemented into the game rather than sold at a premium for a game that's already full priced. I don't think the microtransactions will strongly adversely affect the experience, but, it's there and you do get to see some of the things that you might be missing out on because of this monetization model. And the thing is, I don't know if there are any items that are specifically locked to the real money store that cannot be bought through Hermes, but there's definitely an incentive of, hey, skip the grind of earning these cool cosmetics by just buying them through the store instead of having to do dailies and weeklies and earn Electrum and go through a more tedious process. So I'm not a big fan of that. But yeah, all of the progression is done through this central hub called the Hall of the Gods. This is where restored gods will show up, kind of like sages in a Zelda game or something. And this is also where you do all your progression and where you get to access the things that will allow you to spend the currencies to upgrade health, stamina, weapons, armor, you name it. And this is also where you can access the character creation, so you can customize Fenyx at any point in the game, not just initially, which I really like. I was constantly adjusting Fenyx's appearance until I stumbled upon something I was satisfied with. Though I do wish the character creator was more robust, had more facial modification features, because all you have in the game are a handful of facial presets that cannot be fully customized. But, you know, it's serviceable, it's there, it's fine. They could have done a little more with it. So with all the key gameplay elements out of the way, let's talk about story, characters, dialogue, and presentation. I've got to say, I was surprised to find myself invested in aspects of the game's narrative and characters. So the story, the plot of Immortals is actually quite simple. You are Fenyx, you're this lowly shield bearer and seemingly the sole survivor of a ship crash that sees Fenyx wind up in the land of the gods. She discovers that this evil god Typhon, once imprisoned by Zeus, broke himself free from imprisonment and is now resolute on exacting vengeance. And so to that end, the four main gods of this isle, Aphrodite, Athena, Ares, and Hephaistos, have been physically and mentally turned into lesser versions of themselves. And so your task is to go around, find the gods, restore them to their original form so they can help you defeat Typhon and restore the land to its original splendor. The narrative framing is kind of interesting, where you're playing a story as narrated to Zeus by Prometheus. And so throughout the whole game, you actually get to hear Prometheus and Zeus chiming in, bickering, narrating, and or commenting on what's happening. After the intro portion, it's not constant. It happens from time to time when major developments occur, but it's definitely there. And a lot of it is just sort of lighthearted, humorous banter that spotlights how done Prometheus is with Zeus's attitude, shenanigans, or how unbearably flawed the gods are as a whole. Some of the dialogue between Zeus and Prometheus serves to narrate key developments in the main story. Some of it provides historical context for some of the areas that you visit or enemies and bosses that you encounter. And then there are some that actually do serve to develop Prometheus and Zeus as characters.
He drove me up the wall!
No, what are you saying, Athena? This can't be. I was only trying to help.
Old favorites die hard.
And while the game's plot is simple, defeat the big bad guy, I was surprised to find myself drawn to the game's characters. Fenyx, as well as all of the gods. Fenyx, him or herself, is a very likable protagonist. I play the female version, love the performance there, and she's always this kind of optimistic character. And the gods, on the other hand, in their lesson form, they're always pessimistic and they're coping with their flaws, refusing to return to their original form because they think they deserve what they got. And Fenyx kind of goes out to instill confidence and restore them to who they used to be, while at the same time inspiring these same gods to kind of be better versions of themselves, learn from their mistakes. Zeus's actions throughout Greek mythology and the way he treated his children in particular are often referenced and called into question and highlighted. The game's story overall feels like a deconstruction of these Greek gods, and it sees these gods reflect on their own actions, and it's actually kind of really interesting. It's not super deep. I think they could have gone a bit deeper with the character development and exploration, and I did find that there are certain plot twists that were quite predictable, but there was enough characterization there to keep me invested in these different characters. The tone of the game is also very lighthearted and humorous, and you can really see this in the visuals alone with how colorful and expressive the graphics and animations are. And the graphics, while far from technically the most advanced that I've seen, the great art style really makes up for that. But the writing especially really leans into the game's light, colorful, expressive nature. Jokes are constantly breaking the fourth wall.
Well, that's the end of Fenyx. Perfectly passable storytelling. I won't lie, there were moments that dragged, but you really got me with that ending.
They're always very kind of on the nose. They speak with contemporary slang and make contemporary references here and there.
One of those evil parasites is about to save your royal ass.
My ass is safely lodged in the Aegean stables.
overall, I actually did come to enjoy this game's sense of humor quite a bit. It's very self-aware, makes fun of itself a lot, makes fun of the clusterfuck that is Greek mythology and its events. One of my favorites is Ares, who was transformed into a chicken or a hen. He has some especially amusing dialogue and moments.
You're quaking, shaking, little heart. Crap. My God! All right, the jig is up. It's not your turn, Bear. Do not be sorry. Be better.
And when the gods are interacting with each other and kind of bickering, the dialogue can be genuinely funny.
Are you all good again?
Not a feather remains.
Oh,
What is it?
even, you know, nothing chickeny remains?
This is definitely not a cinematic masterpiece or some nuanced, mind-blowing story, but there is definitely heart to it. One last topic I'd like to cover are technical issues, bugs, glitches, flaws, and whatnot. I will say that of the recently released Ubisoft games, Watch Dogs Legion, Assassin's Creed Valhalla, and Immortals Fenyx Rising, this one feels like the more polished experience. But I did encounter a few frustrating and prominent issues. The one that really stands out is a problem where the game sometimes crashes during an animation that plays right after I upgrade some gear at the forge. This crash happened like 3 or 4 times throughout my playthrough, and every time it happened, I was forced to exit out of the game and restart it. Then there was one time where the game crashed while I was swapping cosmetics for my gear in a Vault of Tartarus, and restarting the game there forced me to have to redo the vault all over again, which was frustrating. And then during one quest where I had to clear some blockage from water wheels, I encountered this bug where the water wheels were already unclogged, unblocked before I got there. And I didn't know that this was a bug. I thought I was missing something, so I spent like an hour searching for the thing I need to do to progress this quest until I eventually figured maybe it's a glitch, and so once I restarted the game, the blockage was displayed properly. Yeah, that bug led me to waste a whole hour kind of wandering around, not knowing what to do. There was another time where I encountered an issue where light attacks for some reason would not connect with enemies. Though this was momentary, it did correct itself, but still bizarre and still disruptive. There were some collision inconsistencies that I stumbled upon, so in a Vault of Tartarus, I was trying to make a specific jump, and so to that end, I wanted to stand on a pillar. For some reason, I could stand on this one small pillar, but this big pillar I'd slip out of if I tried to stand on it. Like, the game wasn't allowing me to stand on the big pillar, but I was allowed to stand on the small pillar. It was just strange. And speaking of pillars, there was one moment where my character clipped right through a pillar and got stuck there, so I was forced to reload from the last checkpoint because I couldn't get out. In my 33 hours playthrough, I would say those were the biggest technical issues that I encountered, and they didn't happen so frequently that the game was made unplayable by any means, but they were definitely prominent enough where those few times that stuff happened, the gameplay experience was disrupted. I was forced to redo some stuff, or I ended up wasting time. So hopefully some of this stuff will be ironed out on day one or soon after launch. But these technical issues, you know, they aren't enough to wane my enthusiasm for this game or my recommendation of this game. It's a sizable game, but not so much that it overstays its welcome like other Ubisoft games can. Again, it took me about 33 hours to beat with a healthy mix of main quest and side activities like the vaults or finding stuff in the world. And there are still a ton of vaults and other side activities and other icons on the map that I have not visited, that I have yet to complete. I would surmise that if I try to do everything, it would take me maybe 50 or more hours. 50, I think, is the least. 50 hours or more to complete literally everything. And then there's a New Game Plus on top of that for those who really enjoy the experience and want to delve back in. There are enough drawbacks here where I wouldn't say this is quite the magical experience that Breath of the Wild was for me, but this is still a really great game that I'd highly recommend to anyone looking for just a fun, lighthearted, but still engaging open-world action-adventure game. And I really hope that Ubisoft will strive to continue experimenting with new types of games, because a lot of Ubisoft games these past few years have felt kind of stale and samey to me, using basically the same exoskeleton. Immortals Fenyx Rising still has hints of that Ubisoft checklist style of, progression and mission completion, but it has enough elements to counteract that as well. And so I hope they will continue experimenting and expanding their horizons. But with that, ladies and gentlemen, I hope you enjoyed my review of Immortals Fenyx Rising. If you want to support the channel, by the way, you can buy some merch. We got the Young Out shirts right here. Back there, you can see the Young Yeah Nuka Dark Rum parody cups that parodies Bethesda screw up with the whole Dark Rum fiasco. You got surprise mechanics, loot box shaped stress boxes that you can squeeze when you're stressed out, because loot boxes stress me out. You got the Yong Yeah hats back there. All the merch can be found in the Yong Yeah store, yongyeah.com. Really proud of how they turned out. Worked on them every step of the way, and every purchase goes a long way to supporting the channel, and appreciate everyone who's already purchased their merch. Really happy with the reception so far. But I hope you enjoyed my review of Immortals Fenyx Rising. Let me know in the comments below whether you're interested in checking this title out, and to be further updated on all things gaming news, reviews, and discussions, stay tuned right here on Young Yeah. I'll see you guys next time. Young out.